I am so happy to be here. This has already been worth it, hasn't it? I've learned some stuff, and it's just inspiring to get to talk with these guys and listen to these two folks. I've known them for many years, and they're beautiful people, and they're leaders in their respective areas, and so I'm just thankful for Western for pulling this together and bringing the three of us together for such a time as this. We need these kinds of opportunities to talk together because there's a number of areas in the Christian community that are kind of contentious, and one of them is counseling and psychology, and it's very easy to get in our own little silos and not connect with others, and this is a wonderful idea, and may it spread, So, what I wanted to do was give I wanted to begin by giving some kind of historical background. I think that in our culture, it's impossible to really understand certain things without understanding something of history. And I think psychology and counseling and the foment that there is in the Christian community is an area where we really need some history in order to understand what's going on. So I'm gonna talk about, however, I'm gonna do that from the vantage point of a position that's been called Christian psychology, and I'll explain a little bit about where that term comes from. It's one of the things about all these terms, biblical counseling, and integration in Christian psychology. Lots of people use it in lots of different ways, and so you always have to ask, what do you mean by that? To kind of get an understanding of where people are at on the continuum, and so it is with Christian psychology. But I represent that kind of position in the Five Views books that are out there, and so that's kind of my vantage point. But we'll talk more about that later today. But I want to answer this question: why are there different Christian approaches to psychology and counseling? There we go. I got the idea to edit the first Five Views book on psychology and Christianity, and then another one came out about 10 years later on counseling and Christianity, in part to promote this very kind of dialogue. I was at a Christian liberal arts college in Minnesota, and I just was aware that people are not talking to each other in their silos. And I thought, one of these Five Views books where they get to dialogue a little bit would be good. And it was a wonderful experience, and some of you apparently are still benefiting from that, which I'm always happy to hear. But one of the questions that I think the book like that poses is, why are there these different views? And so I got a lot of text. I am a teacher, and it helps me to focus and not get lost in all the things that I want to say. So I'm going to read through this material with you, and you let me know if the slides up there don't match what I'm looking at here. But this is my explanation. Over the past 200 years, Western culture has undergone a massive conversion from a Christian worldview to a naturalistic worldview, or maybe a naturalistic humanistic worldview, if I could put those two words together, as a majority of Western intellectuals have embraced some form of naturalism. So that really just kind of typifies what we've all experienced, at least among the intellectuals in our culture. And of course, it always takes longer for that to filter down. Francis Schaeffer, I think, mentioned that to the common people. But we're living in a day now where it's kind of finally the rubber has hit the road. Maybe this election, in a way, symbolizes the fact that, yep, we're definitely a post-Christian culture. Even the Republican Party is post-Christian, and it's a new era. And in some ways, I think many Christians have been waiting for the kind of impact that the 60s began, and in a way the 20s before that, although probably none of us were around at that point. But this has been a long, slow conversion. over 3,000 years, followers of the God of the Bible developed a rich and sophisticated version of psychology based on theological and philosophical understandings of human beings, and a God-centered way of dealing with many common psychospiritual problems, and did that work in monasteries and in churches. And so it's not like psychology was invented in the 1800s or the 20th century, but the kind of psychology has been developing for centuries upon centuries, and the kind that the West was most familiar with, at least over the last 2,000 years, was Christian, largely, Judeo-Christian. However, since the late 1800s, modern psychology arose. And that term modern is important. A version of psychology based on naturalism, largely, and empirical observation, and has produced a vast literature on human beings and developed complex ways of dealing with psychological problems, but without God. It's naturalistic. It's got a naturalistic worldview that undergirds the literature. However, it's identified and addressed many biological and psychosocial phenomena, many never recognized before. And it's taken over, during this time period, public mental health. So that public mental health is solidly in the hands of folks who basically assume a naturalistic, humanistic worldview. And then we were born. And this conversion has already happened. All of us were born into the conversion. By 1950, most of us were born by then, most of us. That conversion already was completed. At least in terms of the major universities and public mental health, and so it's an accepted reality that we know, and this conjunction of these two histories, one being 3,000 years of Christian development, and then another much shorter, but still very profound and completely taken over our culture in terms of the psychology of our day, and the treatment of people with severe mental illness. This has created an intellectual and soul care crisis for the church of enormous proportions. I can't overemphasize how it's a crisis. And Alistair McIntyre, Christian philosopher, is the one that kind of highlighted this in the area of moral philosophy, and I'm just applying it to the world within which we all live. And this crisis, intellectual and soul care crisis, has resulted in different understandings of how to deal with it. One of these approaches has focused primarily on the Bible, God's special revelation about the most important psychological and spiritual matters. And this approach has been located primarily in local churches and seminaries and practiced by pastors, and it has the name now of biblical counseling. Pastors have been doing, and monks and nuns have been doing biblical counseling for centuries. It's not a new invention. It's been highlighted because of the cultural crisis within which we live. But it's been around for a long time. Another approach has been focused primarily on engaging modern psychology and participating in public mental health and subtly influencing both. Although to see that graph, not so subtly, in some areas, right? Forgiveness, humility, religious values and psychotherapy, and others. But in order to do so, integration has had to play by its rules. If you don't play by the rules, guess what? You don't get published. You don't get hired. You can't have an influence if you're not willing to play by the rules of those who are in power. That's reality. And we need to be strategic. We need to be as wise as a serpent and as harmless as a dove. And we need to be involved in all segments of culture as Christians. So this approach has been located primarily in Christian universities and practiced by academics and mental health professionals, and it goes by the name of integration. Well, I represent a Christian psychology approach, and it has its own particular location on the continuum, but it sees itself, as I see myself, as an ally of both, and a friend of both, and a proponent of both. So what is Christian psychology? Well, it's an approach that's also trying to respond to modern psychology, but by seeking to develop a distinctly Christian version of psychology and soul care. And I like the word soul care, but the way I use it means it refers to spiritual direction, counseling, and psychotherapy. But I use that as an overarching term that covers the gamut of the care of souls. That's how I use it. And what that means is it's a Christian version of psychology and soul care that's based on a Christian worldview entirely. That's the goal, to do that. Based primarily on the Bible and theological study, Christian philosophy, and spiritual formation, all the resources of the Christian tradition. However, also informed by the enormous contributions of modern psychology. But here's the proviso that we got a nice introduction to by Mark McMinn, interpreted from a Christian worldview. So from a Christian psychology standpoint, I see the goal of a Christian psychology is to develop a distinctly Christian approach to psychology and soul care, using our own enormous resources, but also learning from modern psychology wherever we can. And so much of it is valuable, and it's a fruit of common grace, what theologians have called common grace. I like to call it creation grace. But whatever we call it, it's ultimately all truth does come from God. All truth is God's truth, as integrationists are known to say. And of course they're right. Augustine said that sort of thing. This isn't a new position. The goal then of a Christian psychology is to produce a psychology and a set of psychotherapies that are based on Christian beliefs, norms, and practices that are just as sophisticated as modern psychology, and that can compete and engage with it as a discrete entity over against modern psychology, and presumably over against Buddhist psychology and Hindu psychology and any well-developed psychology that's grounded in its own faith commitments, its philosophy, and empirical observation. As an academic and professional endeavor, the project of a Christian psychology, I think, is ideally suited for Christian universities and seminaries. But I'm also going to argue, to anybody who will listen, that it ought to be allowed to participate in mainstream psychology and public mental health. But nobody else believes that right now, and so, or at least very few people would agree with that currently in mainstream psychology and public mental health. But I'm working on it a little bit, little by little, and there are others who are working on that. It's a more postmodern agenda, if I can put it that way. I'm not a postmodernist, for the record. Is that being recorded? But I do think postmodernism has certain kind of leverage in our culture that we ought to take advantage of. I think Christianity is both pre-modern and postmodern at the same time. And my friend Paul Watson would say, actually, a Christian position that's historically informed is going to be postmodern. And that's actually kind of, I think, typifies where I'm at. I'm wanting to move beyond modernism and postmodernism, learning from both, being mindful of the contributions of both perspectives, but ultimately grounded in a Christian worldview that transcends the vagaries of our culture, and at least ideally. None of us are free from that, of course. All right, so that's a little bit of what I consider to be the agenda of a Christian psychology. I also want to emphasize a little bit something that I've only been working on the last few years, but it seems to me really important. And I think it's especially important for seminaries, because I think they have a unique calling in our culture. I'm persuaded that that's where the action is going to be in the Christian counseling world in the next generation. And so I think a Christian psychology approach is particularly well poised to help Christian universities and seminaries develop the training of Christian mental health professionals. And I think what that necessitates is a two-track approach based on the kind of counseling one is working with. And so this is a very summary, very brief summary, just a few statements. But one track would be for a Christian mental health professional when they're working with non-Christians. What can you do? And I think there ought to be a whole bunch of books written on that tries to articulate it in our language. And one of our kind of language, part of our vocabulary would be what I like to call using creation grace resources, the kinds of resources that all people have in common. And this is where integration has excelled over the last few decades in utilizing creation grace resources and using them with Christians and non-Christians. That's one track. Track 2, however, would be working with Christians. And when Christian mental health professionals are working with Christians, we can use creation grace resources that we have in common with all human beings, as well as what we might call redemptive grace resources, the latter of which is only available to Christians. And because we're in union with Christ, we have all these incredible blessings that are laid up for us in heaven and that are true about us. We're in relationship with Jesus Christ, and we're justified and holy. And these become the foundation of a Christian identity. And the most important relationship that we have is our communion with our great triune God. And those are soul-building resources that we can't use with non-Christians because they don't apply, but they apply to Christians. And this is what the biblical counseling world has been making much of for the last few decades. And from my vantage point, I see most of the programs that I'm aware of in America working on track 1 for good, or track 2 for good. And there are no programs that I'm aware of that have really developed a two-track approach that can train Christian mental health professionals and any other people, ministers who are interested in that sort of thing, to go either way based on the person that's in the room in front of them. And I want to hold that out as a possible goal and something we can talk about this afternoon, perhaps. Well, where does this come from? Some of this thinking. Well, I hope it's biblical, but it's also informed by the Christian tradition. And so I'm going to suggest that Christian psychology is based on the work of two saints. One of them, St. Augustine, and his idea that there are fundamentally two cities or two communities in the world. And the Christian scholars, or I should add, the Christian counselors' community of identity is the city of God. And then St. Abraham, you may not have heard of him, but in the Reformed community, he's a saint. St. Abraham Kuyper, especially us Dutch Christians, we St. Abraham. And he wrote a book, Principles of Sacred Theology, where he took this a step further in the late 1800s. And he said, if there are such a thing, given that there are two cities, that's going to lead to two sciences, two versions of science. Two fundamentally different versions of the human sciences, including psychology, with the Christian version being rooted in divine regeneration. Because we've been made alive by God's Spirit, we see the world differently, we see human beings differently, and we're going to interpret those things differently. Now, he was very clear. That doesn't mean we have to reinvent everything, by no means. We're going to share the same basic abilities to do observation and measurement that non-Christians do, and we don't have to do it over again. We can benefit from the science of modernity insofar as it's not distorted by their worldview. But we're also going to have to do our own work. And that's, so when people say, "Who are you, Eric?" I say, "I'm a Kuyperian psychologist." I love saying that, but it usually produces a puzzled look on their face. And then I get to talk to them about Abraham Kuyper, which I love to do. Also, Christian psychology was inspired by the recent success of Christian philosophy. People like Alvin Plantinga, C. Stephen Evans, and Robert Roberts. And over the last 30 years, there's been a secret revolution in the field of psychology, in the field of philosophy. 50, 60 years ago, it was hard to get a job if you were a Christian and you were very explicit about it. But now it's recognized that there is this uncomfortable group of folks, quite large and influential, that are Christian philosophers. I could put up there Charles Taylor, a Catholic philosopher who recently received a $1 million prize by some group that I don't even know who they are, but it's a philosophy prize, and he wrote the book The Secular Age, which is I bought it, but it's this big and I've never read it. But thankfully, James K. Smith has written a nice little 180-page summary of it that I can read, and it makes sense to me. So there's been this wonderful work that's been done by brilliant people, much smarter than me, and they have shown that you can be a respectable thinker, scholar in our day, and be a blatant Christian. And C. Stephen Evans and Robert Roberts also were experts in Soren Kierkegaard, and Soren Kierkegaard happened to call himself a Christian psychologist before Freud was born. And if Western history had gone different, and there had been this massive revival in the late 1800s, and Freud had gotten saved, we don't know what the 20th century would have looked like. But as it were, Kierkegaard was a kind of a contrarian, and he had no disciples. He had one disciple, and he told him to stay away from him and stop bothering him. And he just wasn't a very nice guy, Soren Kierkegaard, which is a whole other story. And so there was basically his Christian psychology project just dropped dead until sometime in the 20th century, and some Christian evangelical philosophers started studying him again, recognizing this guy's got a lot to offer. And people like Evans and Roberts began writing, advocating, hey, you psychologists, you ought to do some reading in these folks in your own tradition, and maybe you could revitalize or help to develop this Christian psychology approach. That's some of the background to the position of a Christian psychology. I think in keeping with the invitation, I want to give a little bit of a synopsis of my professional story. I have so many stories to tell. I have to be careful, but we'll see what I do here. My own story, I was raised in a nominally Christian home, basically liberal Christian, and I don't remember ever praying with my parents, but we went to church, and it seemed pretty irrelevant to the rest of our lives, and so as soon as I was old enough, I left behind whatever meager faith that was attempted to be shared with me in that context. And I don't know if you can be influenced by scientism at the age of 16 or 17, but that was my orientation. I was a naturalist. I was committed to evolution. I used to look for opportunities to argue with fundamentalist Christians in high school about their stupid view of origins. But that was not ultimately very satisfying. And actually, part of my story, probably the most defining event of my early life, I should share. I was responsible. This was in the early 70s, and I was sexually active and was responsible for conceiving a child at that time. And my girlfriend and I decided to give that child up for adoption. Although honestly, I would have been quite happy with an abortion at the time. But that rocked my world in ways that I didn't have categories for fully understanding. And it sent me on a journey. And in the providence of God, through paganism, but in the providence of God, it led me to a conversion at the age of 18. And I gave my life to the Lord, and was saved into a fundamental Baptist church. However, not having any education, in the Bible, my pastor directed me to go to Toronto Baptist Seminary, which had a big impact on me. and gave me a sound theology that I still love and cherish to this day. And I think one of the key needs of our day is catechesis. We're entering an age, maybe we've been there for a while, that's not unlike the early church, where they took pains to educate people who were converted from paganism in order to take seriously their Christian commitment and Christian faith. And I got that at Toronto Baptist Seminary, and that's one of the things that I think seminaries are offering in our day for lay people and other sorts of careers. It's very foundational. It's a time of catechesis. It's a time of we use the word today discipleship, but that has impacted me profoundly. That's where I first learned about Abraham Kuyper, for example. But it ended up I got into social work after I graduated from that, and I became aware that the world was very divided. When I was at TBS, I encountered the works of Jay Adams, and he was radical, and I wanted to be radical because I knew what paganism was like and scientism, and I knew that they were a dead end to me, and I wanted to be a radical Christian, and so I threw myself wholeheartedly into the nouthetic counseling movement, and one of the things that it fit very well with the fundamentalism that I adhered to at that time of my life. I was a King James only guy for a while, and I ended up getting married. But we had struggles in our marriage, and while my life had been, like a 180 degree change in my conversion to the Lord, I found that I was still having internal psychological problems. Although I wouldn't have said that in the early years of our marriage, but I was having conflict in my marriage, and I didn't have answers for that because I was doing all the right things. I was reading. I knew all the right theology, and my behavior had changed. I was no longer doing the pagan stuff that I was doing before, and that was also rocking my world. But at that time, I was very committed to a nouthetic approach, and I remember calling somebody at CCEF there. This might have been before Ed Welch was there, and I said, I don't want to go to just any integrationist. I want to go to a radical, nouthetic counselor. Can you recommend one that you really can endorse? And they said, well, gee, the only person that we can really endorse happens to be 6 hours away, from you. But my wife and I drove 6 hours to get to this location. And we sat down and met this person who was a leader in the field at that time. And within about 15 to 20 minutes, he had identified that my wife was the problem, and was kind of narrowing in on her anger and her resistance and so on. And I was a little unsettled by that, but I kind of appreciated him identifying the things that I had been sharing with her, over the time. But she began crying and didn't really stop crying until the end of the session. And then we drove back home the 6 hours back, and she didn't talk to me. And I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I wasn't the only problem. And that was the beginning for me of recognizing maybe just having the right theology and the right behavior isn't all that there is in this complicated world of marriage, and learning how to relate to your spouse in love. And my wife told me later that it confirmed her worst suspicions. She grew up in a dysfunctional fundamentalist family, where she learned that there was something really bad about her, and I had been kind of, in so many words, implying that over the 2 years that we were married. And she wasn't that she wouldn't talk. She said she couldn't talk for those 6 hours back. And I didn't have categories for that. She shared that with me weeks later. But it rocked me. There was something that I was missing and I didn't know, because it wasn't just intellectual knowledge, but it was something deeper than that. And so anyway, this began, all of this together began leading me. I was working in social work, Christian social work, Christian halfway house that I was working at. And I began to realize, well, while I sensed my theology had done really good things in me, but it hadn't cured all of my problems. And I was also, because of my Reformed theology, I was aware of this doctrine of common grace, and that God had given science and culture and the arts to the human race to work with, and that Christians and non-Christians could collaborate in many respects on common projects. And so I knew that the sciences were in that category, and I began to read psychology now with different eyes than the eyes of a fundamentalist, more actually from a Reformed worldview standpoint. And I recognized, gee, not everything that secular psychologists had written was worth throwing out, needed to be thrown out. In fact, I found that there was a lot of wisdom there. They were missing the heart, the most important things. Obviously, there wasn't Jesus, and it wasn't grounded in a Christian worldview, but there was lots of other material there that was just a part of the way that God had created the world, and was relatively accurate descriptions of the nature of things. At least, maybe I would want to say at a superficial level. They were missing the heart, as I say, but there were many important things. Not negligible things that were being identified. And I ended up going to get a further education. I went to Calvin College, which was a Reformed school. They loved St. Abraham Kuyper there too. And they talked a lot about common grace and about trying to figure out, what does a Christian worldview do to all the disciplines? And I got an MA in Christian Studies in the behavioral sciences there. Went to seminary, studied with Cornelius Plantinga, Alvin's brother, and a class on sin that has marked me to this day. He wrote a great book on sin. What is it? Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, a classic book on sin. And that I found that very, very helpful in preparing me then to go to Michigan State and to study and to get a Ph.D. in psychology. And by that time, I felt called to work in a Christian liberal arts context. And I learned the field of modern psychology. But I felt I was able to study modern psychology with Christian spectacles. Calvin says that the Bible is our spectacles that we use to look at the world and to interpret the world aright. And I think that's what a Christian worldview does give us, largely shaped by the Bible, but also by the Christian tradition and Christian philosophy. And so I felt pretty well prepared to study modern psychology at Michigan State, and it was a wonderful experience. But I also got socialized to some extent into the rules of modern psychology. And so I had one of my favorite professor mentors kind of pull me aside and say, Eric, you probably shouldn't write about God in your papers. It's unprofessional, and I'm just wanting to look out for you, and I want you to advance in the field. And in fact, he used the name Alan Bergen, and he said, you don't want to be like Alan Bergen, that Mormon guy. He's kind of a wacko. And so, that was just the subtle influence of well-meaning secular mentors. And I tried to get an article published, a phenomenological study of the fear of the dark. And I tacked on the end a Christian interpretation of my research findings, and it was rejected with the recommendation that if I just would delete the Christian interpretation, it would get published. And I struggled with that. Should I do that? Lord, what do you think I should do? And I decided that it would be okay for me to resubmit, and it got accepted. But in that process, I also learned, maybe I'm not cut out for mainstream psychology. And because I just don't know if I can function in a world where my faith would have to be so repressed. And so I was happily moving into a Christian liberal arts environment. And I took a job at vocationally. I ended up having a part-time job. I don't know if you can see that, but it's Wheaton College. And I got one year at Wheaton College. And it's interesting how our stories intersect ever so slightly. This was before Mark was there, and I was there at the time right before the CID program started, and I talked with Stan Jones about that program, and was just enamored by the beauty of what they were trying to do there. Wheaton, is still one of the greatest universities in our day, Christian universities, and I was privileged to be there for a year. And I also got to know Robert Roberts there, Christian philosopher there. He taught the integration course there. And he introduced me to the term Christian psychology and said, you got to read Soren Kierkegaard. It's like, wow, I never knew about that. But some things fit together there in ways that I found really encouraging. I also became aware of the struggle of an integration program because they Stan Jones is one of the great integrationists of our day and has done some most important work of any Christian in the field. And wanting to have a doctoral program that's APA accredited, I think, is a God-glorifying agenda. And he was wanting very much to do that. But I remember talking with him about the struggle of trying to find faculty who understood his vision of integration. And there just weren't enough people out there. But we have to staff a school, and you just find the best people you can. And the problem that all the liberal arts and sciences have to deal with in the Christian community is all of us have to get our Ph.D.s at secular schools. What do we do about that? The only two fields that you don't have to do that is in theology. Thank God for some seminaries and divinity schools that are out there that train PhDs in theology. And then there are two really good doctoral programs in Christian philosophy, Notre Dame and Baylor. And so you can get a PhD in studying with Christian faculty. All the other disciplines, the best you can hope to do is to find a mentor at a particular school to study with until the development of these programs in psychology. And there are at least 8 of them now. And they emerged at such a time where it was able to be done, and yet, in order to be APA accredited, you have to observe the rules, and that's the state of the art right now in Christian higher ed, and it just makes it hard. Sometimes in seminaries, it's easy for us to throw rocks at the Christian universities that are out there because they're not as biblical as we see they ought to be. But we need to remember the socialization that happens for such individuals who love God but have to study with folks that don't necessarily share their values, and to do so for the glory of God and in order to serve the Lord. So it's just complicated. One of my favorite adages that I use in my teaching and my counseling is life is more complicated than I used to think it was. And the days of black and white thinking, I mean, in some ways life is black and white, God versus sin, okay, of course. But life is so complicated, and serving God in a post-Christian culture like ours is extremely complicated. At any rate, I ended up I spent a year at Wheaton. I got happily hired at now it's called University of Northwestern, and I taught psychology there for 10 years, and I loved it. And I went to it because it was an integration program. By that time, I called myself an integrationist, and very quickly I began to realize that it's going to be complicated here as well. I remember hearing, when I first arrived, that there was an argument between the psychology department that I was a part of and one of the Bible faculty who was nouthetic. And I said, I think both sides have some value. I think I can help be a peacemaker here. And so the three of us went out to lunch, our first my first semester. And by the end of the lunch, both of them had come to the conclusion that I was on the other person's side. And I just thought, wow, this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. And it's very easy to be misunderstood and misinterpreted. And I had the disadvantage of being cocky in my own way and coming across a bit like a know-it-all. And before I was aware of it, and my integration colleagues were really quite alienated from me and felt that I was really undermining what they were doing. And I regret some of the things I did and said in those years. But I ended up getting kicked out of the psychology department for a while. And thankfully, the school didn't kick me out. And I ended up in the Bible department. I taught some Bible classes for a while. And it was fine, in some respects, but it was awkward in other respects. And we got a new president in, and he heard this story, and he kind of forced me back in to the department. And it was just uncomfortable for all of us. And a dear friend of mine, Tom Schreiner, who I think has some connection to this school, and Bruce Ware, by that time, both of them had gone to Southern Baptist Seminary, and there was an integration program in counseling, but it was a seminary program, and they wanted a more biblical and theological orientation to psychology and counseling, but it really meant a redirection of my career into the area of counseling. And I just felt that this was of the Lord. I had been doing some pastoral care work at Bethlehem Baptist for a few years there. I'd gone to John Piper's church for most of my time in Minnesota, and wanted to try and figure out, what does Christian hedonism look like in the counseling world? And I thought that, wow, this is it, Lord. Thank you for calling me into this new area. But it was a change. And I went there saying, I really don't belong in a seminary. I belong in a Christian university, but I'm not sure I can find a Christian university that wants to be Kuyperian enough, that sees that all the arts and the sciences need to be grounded in a Christian worldview in a kind of radical way, and enough, at least for a person like me, to fit in well. And maybe a seminary would be a good place for me. And I've been there for 16 years, and I've loved it wonderfully. About 5 years into the program, there was a change because of the views of our president and the vice president at that time. And they turned the program into a biblical counseling program. And for a while, I wasn't sure if I was going to get to stay. But thankfully, the vice president read a book that had just come out that I published called Foundations for Soul Care, which is fairly theological. And he read that and said, we would like you to stay in the program, and I've been happily serving there ever since. But it's also, there's some ironies in my story. I can happily work with integrationists. I mean that. The Lord knows my heart. I can also happily work with biblical counselors, and have done so over the years. And I think both of them are serving in very important and strategic ways in the kingdom of God and in our culture. And as we've heard from these two archetypal representatives of these two approaches, making a difference in the church and in the world and in the field of psychology. But my particular calling has been now most recently in the seminary context, and then seeking to develop a Christian version of psychology. And so I've been involved in the Society for Christian Psychology and helped to found that, and more recently started a nonprofit in the Louisville area called the Institute for Christian Psychology. But there are other folks who are also sympathetic to this. The Healing Prayer movement, folks who are sympathetic to that. I think they're doing Christian psychology in some way. And there are some other institutes for Christian psychology in Germany and South Africa. I was thinking of posting some of those, but I just ran out of time. But that just gives you a little bit of an overview of what I've been about and my own particular orientation, and why I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you.